Now comes my favorite part of the program, to introduce a person who I have been deeply inspired by. I'm an immigrant to the United States, and when I first began educating myself politically, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States was an absolutely crucial part of my education. And I have to say that that book enables me to look a right-wing white male in the eye who tells me that as an immigrant, I'm not fulfilling, the American way, or I'm not living the good patriotic life of an American by speaking out and criticizing this government. And all I have to do is cite Howard Zinn's history and say, no, I am following exactly in the footsteps of the rich legacy of dissent in this country that is part of the history of this country. And I'm so proud, because that is the America that I love, the America of the workers and the laborers and the longshoremen and the garment workers. Those are the Americans whose footsteps I do feel that I am hopefully following in, and whose legacy I hope to continue. And that, I wouldn't have had that confidence had it not been for this very powerful and very important book. I want to quote briefly from an essay written by Howard Zinn in 2001, December 2001, which crystallizes for me what an important voice he is. Afghanistan is an issue close to my heart. Some of you may know I do solidarity work with a women's group in Afghanistan, and in December 2001, it was only 2.5 months after the US had begun bombing Afghanistan, and Howard Zinn wrote an essay called A Just Cause, Not a Just War, where he said, I believe two moral arguments can be made about the present so-called war. The September 11th attack constitutes a crime against humanity and cannot be justified, and the bombing of Afghanistan is also a crime which cannot be justified. And yet voices across the political spectrum, many on the left, have described this war as a, quote, just war. I have puzzled over this. How can a war be truly just when it involves the daily killing of civilians, when it causes hundreds of thousands of men and women and children to leave their homes to escape the bombs, when it may not find those who planned the September 11th attacks, and when it will multiply the ranks of people who are angry enough at this country to become terrorists themselves? This war amounts to a gross violation of human rights, and it will produce the exact opposite of what is wanted. It will not end terrorism, it will proliferate terrorism. Okay? That was December 2001. We are now in May 2006, and the words that Howard Zinn said back then have come true. We have seen a strengthening of fundamentalist forces in the form of the Northern Alliance, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, you name it, and Afghanistan, once more being forgotten, has in fact become another haven for terrorists, just as it was before 9/11. Meanwhile, of course, the ordinary people are caught between the forces of Western imperialism and Islamic fundamentalism. So I thank Howard Zinn for speaking out at a time when it was really difficult to question the justice of this war, the so-called just war. Howard Zinn is a historian, playwright, social activist. He was a shipyard worker and Air Force bombardier before he went to college under the GI Bill and received his PhD from Columbia University. He's taught at Spelman College and Boston University and been a visiting professor at the University of Paris and the University of Bologna. He's received many awards, including the Thomas Merton Award, the Eugene Debs Award, the Upton Sinclair Award, and the Lannan Literary Award. And he's written, of course, many, many books, including People's History of the United States, and his latest book, Just War, which he will be signing copies of tonight after his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Howard Zinn.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you, KPFK. Thank you, Emergency. Emergency has this remarkable bunch of people here in LA who came out of nowhere, just like LA came out of nowhere, I guess. And they're obviously very good organizers. Well, I've known Gino Strada for a few years now. I got to know him when I was asked to write an introduction to his book, Green Parrots, A War Surgeon's Diary, which I urge you all to read. So I did it, and in writing the introduction, of course, I had to read it. Sometimes that happens. And so, difficult book to read. Well, obviously, and Gino has shown you here the kind of work he's done, and you can only imagine what in 10 to 15 years of working on war victims, what that means, what that's like. But what interested me was when I came to the end of his book. And at the end of his book, he says, in effect, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to operate on children anymore. I don't want to amputate the arms of kids who have been devastated by landmines anymore. You know, we need to abolish war. And then he invited me to Rome, which is, of course, a difficult invitation to accept. But I went. And then you might say he enlisted me in the idea of starting to spread the word in this country and everywhere, the word that we cannot accept war anymore as a solution for any of the problems that we have in the world. I mean, we are now struggling, we in this country, to stop the war in Iraq. We're working very hard on that. And we're going to succeed. The war in Iraq is going to have to come to an end. But what happens then? What happens after the war in Iraq? Our country has been fighting war after war after war ever since the end of World War II, ever since that war which was supposed to bring an end to war. And after Vietnam, we thought, no more wars. And then the government decided also, well, the people of the United States apparently have turned against war. This is bad. They described what they called the Vietnam syndrome. Syndrome is a word for sickness. The sickness was that the American people had turned against the government, against the FBI, against Congress, against the establishment, against the war. This was the Vietnam syndrome, and the United States government set out to somehow do away with that syndrome by fighting small, quick, victorious wars against weak opponents to get the American population accustomed to war, once again. And this is what they've been trying to do. The Iraq War represents the latest of it, except that it hasn't been quick. It's been going on for 3 years. And it may be that the Vietnam syndrome has not been eliminated, that the American people are beginning to understand the futility of war, the immorality of war. We're seeing a growth in consciousness among the American people, and that's a very positive, encouraging thing to see. But what comes next? They're already beating the drums for war in Iran, right? Already talking about bombing Iran, already drawing up the plans. And when they're confronted with this, they said, we're only drawing up plans. They're creating a hysteria about Iran the way they created a hysteria about Iraq. I don't think they will succeed this time. I think the American people have learned something about the war in Iraq, which makes them more suspicious of what the government is saying about Iran. But I think we have to think about not this war, not the next war. We don't want to have to create another anti-war movement, and another anti-war movement, and another anti-war movement. We really have to present in the world the idea, an idea which is sort of obviously utopian and long-term, but an idea which absolutely must take hold. Its time has come, you know, and the idea that war must be abolished. And Gino Strada showed you, told you about Einstein's quote. When Einstein said that in 1932, he was attending a conference in Geneva, which was called the Disarmament Conference. Anytime you see the words disarmament conference, be suspicious. When the governments of the world use the word disarmament, they don't mean it. And so Einstein attended this disarmament conference. He, like so many people, was disillusioned by the horror of World War I. And what did he hear at this disarmament conference? He heard these nations talking about, well, these weapons will be banned, and these weapons will be okay. And he did something which nobody expected Einstein to do. He called a press conference. Einstein doesn't do things like that. But he did, and he said, and you saw those words on the screen, war cannot be humanized, war can only be abolished. And that's the theme of this campaign that we want to initiate. And you're part of the initiation. We expect you to spread the word. You expect you to, not just to stop the war in Iraq, but we expect you to begin talking to everybody you can about the abolition of war itself. Governments are not going to do it. Governments can never be depended to advance the cause of peace or justice or human rights. I mean, in the course of human history, governments have never been dependable in taking care of the needs of people. And after all, governments are not set up for that purpose. Governments are set up to serve certain interests, and those are not the interests of the people. This is a very important thing for people to grasp. People who have some naive conception that we very often grow up with in this country, that the government is our friend, and no, the government is not our friend. Occasionally, it can get friendly. When there's a great people's movement that compels it to be friendly, and then, So it is really up to us. It is up to the people of the world to abolish war, because governments won't do it. And very often you hear it's said that, well, people are not going to do it because war is part of human nature. How many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard, I think I once figured it out, anytime you get into a discussion of war, like 12 minutes into the conversation, somebody says, oh, it's human nature. Test that out. It's a scientific observation of mine. 12 minutes, yeah. If war were a part of human nature, governments would not have to go to such enormous lengths to persuade people to go to war. People would rush spontaneously. No, governments have to work at it. They have to work very hard at it. The natural instincts of people are not for war. The natural instincts of people are for compassion and comradeship and brotherhood and sisterhood. Those are the natural instincts of people, but governments work very hard. They work by seduction, they work by propaganda, and they work by coercion to get people to go to war. No. At the end of World War II, when the Nazi leaders were being tried in Nuremberg, and they were in their prison cells awaiting trial, and a psychologist was given the job of interviewing these Nazi leaders in their prison cells, talking to them. And one of them wrote a book. He kept a diary, he kept notes, and he records in his book a conversation he had with Hermann Goering, second in command to Hitler, head of the Luftwaffe, and he asked, well, how come the German people went along with Hitler? And Goering said, well, of course, people don't want war. Some poor Slav, this was Goering's word, I don't know what the word is in German, but this is how they interpreted it, translated it. Some poor Slav working on a farm, he doesn't want to go to war, but he can be convinced, he can be propagandized, he can be told there's an enemy out there that must be defeated. He can be told that this is done for the country, this is done for the people, and then you can mobilize a population for war. And this is true, Goering said, in any country. That last part of it was interesting to me. It's not just totalitarian governments, it's not just tyrannical governments that propagandize their people for war, it's so-called democratic liberal governments. And of course that has happened in this country again and again and again, where people have been deceived, people have been lied to. We're now aware of all the lies and deceptions that have been told in connection with this war in Iraq. But the history of government lies and deception in order to get the people of the country to go to war, that goes way back. I mean, how else can governments get people to go to war? It goes back to the Mexican War. It goes back to the war in Cuba. It goes back to the Philippines. It goes back through all the wars that we've fought. Deception, lies, and that's how they do it. So our job is to reach back to the essential feelings of people and to break through these fogs of propaganda and cries for war, these false slogans that are raised that talk about we're going to war for democracy, we're going to war for freedom. We now have a history which shows that all these so-called wars for freedom and democracy have not brought freedom and democracy to any of the people that we've waged war against. And they certainly haven't brought freedom and democracy to this country. And you will hear them say, Memorial Day is coming up, come to think of it. Memorial Day is coming up at the end of this month, and you have a lot of flag waving and a lot of trumpets blowing and a lot of speeches made honoring the dead of wars. And of course, yes, the people who died in wars should be honored, but war should not be honored. And the makers of war should not be honored. And you will hear the speech makers say they gave their lives for their country. How many times have you heard that? They gave their lives for their country. There's a double lie in that. One, they did not give their lives were taken away from them, you see. And second, they didn't die for their country, they died for their government. The country did not profit from their deaths. There were people, there were interests that profited from their deaths. In the present case, the young people who are dying in Iraq, thank you. The young people who are dying in Iraq, that's Marco, who's keeping me alive. With regular doses of water and who knows what else, you see. But the young people who are dying in Iraq are not dying for the country. It's a terrible thing to say. The country is not benefiting from their debts. They're dying for Bush and Cheney. They're dying for Halliburton and the corporations that make money out of war. Wise men throughout history have recognized this. Plutarch recognized this. The poor go to war for the benefit of the rich. Eugene Debs recognized this. He was sent to prison for 10 years in World War I for saying it's the poor, the working class, who fight the wars, and it's the rich who send them to war. I went through a certain trajectory myself about war, because there was a time when I believed in the concept of just war. That is, I believed that there were just wars and unjust wars, good wars and bad wars. And I think that's a very, very common belief among people, you know. Although I once had a student who wrote a paper about war, and in her paper she said, you know, wars are like wines. There are good years and bad years. There are good wars and bad wars. But she said, war is not like wine. War is like cyanide. One drop and you're dead. I always remembered what she said, because it fitted my own experience, the development of my own thought, because I volunteered for the Second World War. I had to tell you what war it was so that you wouldn't think it was the Spanish-American War. But I volunteered for that war and became a bombardier in the Air Force, and because I believe this was a good, yes, it was right. It was a good war. Studs Terkel has done a world history of people who lived through World War II, and he calls it the good war. Although if you look closely, you'll see he put quotation marks around good war, because as he talked to people more and more, he found more and more questions from people who had participated in the war about the war. What happened to me is I entered the war as an enthusiastic bombardier. And what could be more just? It was a war against fascism. What could be more evil in the world? I mean, they're trying to portray all these two-bit dictators in the world as Hitlers. No, you know, Noriega of Panama, Saddam Hussein. No, Hitler was evil incarnate, yes, and fascism was evil. And so, yes, I believed in this war, and so I went ahead and I dropped bombs on various cities in Europe, in Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and even France. It wasn't until the war ended that I began to think about what I had been doing. I read John Hersey's account of his interviews with the survivors of Hiroshima.